Now, that means that Finland and Sweden will join NATO. And the thing to say about this is that the Russian response to this decision has been very measured. And I think I would like to say a few things about this before I proceed with the rest of the programme, because, of course, the reality is that Swedish and Finnish neutrality has been a dead letter to all intents and purposes for some time. Now, if we first of all go to the subject of Sweden, Sweden is the country, it's the bigger, richer, more important country. You have to go back here to the 1960s, a time when Sweden was led by its veteran Prime Minister Tage Erlander. Erlander was Prime Minister of Sweden from shortly after the end of the Second World War, right up until the end of the 1960s. He was Prime Minister continuously for 23 years, and he was a Social Democrat, and it was under Tage Erlander that the Swedish Social Democratic model achieved its full form. Sweden became this great paragon of social democracy, which many people mistakenly still think it is. But the thing to understand about Erlander is that Erlander was somebody who was very committed to Swedish neutrality, which undoubtedly he saw as a mechanism for maintaining Swedish independence. And in order to assert this independence, he built up the Swedish armed forces to an extraordinary degree. I can remember back in the 60s and 70s that Sweden was producing all these extraordinary weapons systems, Draken fighters and Viggen fighters and fighter jets, extraordinarily industrial and technological effort for a relatively small country like Sweden. And it was building a turretless tank, which apparently didn't work terribly well, and a self-propelled gun, all extraordinarily elaborate and complex and expensive and rather high-tech looking, and apparently not very effective either. But anyway, that's another story. The point is, Erlander built up Sweden's armed forces to a very considerable extent, and by some measures, in the 1960s, Sweden was spending more on defence per capita than any other country, apart from the United States, the Soviet Union, and Israel. So, this was a major military build-up by Sweden. Now, the point is, who was this military build-up directed against? Did Erlander imagine that there would be an attack on Sweden from the United States and the Western powers? Well, hardly. I mean, that was never really something that anybody in Sweden at that time or since or before has ever taken seriously. Clearly, the enemy against whom this military build-up in Sweden was targeted was the Soviet Union. And on top of all of this, there was another factor, which is that Erlander, at the same time, and some members of his government and of the Swedish political establishment, were in the 50s and 60s toying with the idea of Sweden acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, this did meet quite a lot of opposition within Sweden at that time. It was unpopular with the left of the Swedish Social Democrats. By the way, I should say that Erlander himself was on the right at that time of the Social Democratic Party. The policies he followed would be considered beyond radical by any social democrat or so-called social democrat today. But anyway, Erlander did toy with the idea of acquiring nuclear weapons, and so did several people in the Swedish establishment. But this met with intense opposition, and rather than put his political position at risk, Erlander did a deal, and he did a deal that if Sweden were ever attacked, a certain country would come to Sweden's rescue. And that country was the United States. And that agreement was reached in the 1960s, and it's been in existence ever since, even though it's never talked about very much. But essentially that means that from the mid-1960s, Swedish neutrality became something of a fiction, because by definition, if Sweden enters into some kind of military understanding with the United States, it decides that it's not going to go for nuclear weapons, it's going to retain these powerful conventional armed forces, and it's going to do this deal with the United States, then Sweden, to all intents and purposes, from the United States, from the 1960s, has been a NATO ally, so a Western ally. So I think that's an important point to understand, because there's much talk about Swedish neutrality, but it actually means a lot less in practice, and has meant a lot less in practice than it has appeared to mean in theory. Now, why do the Swedes worry about the Russians? Well, there's a very long history of antagonism between the two countries going back to the 18th century. And I'm not going to go into great details about this. But I would say that one of the key events in Russian-Swedish history is the so-called Great Northern War that was fought between the Russia of Peter the Great and Sweden, and which resulted in Russia's victory and the capture of territory upon which Peter the Great built his capital, the current Russian city of St. Petersburg. And Putin made some comments about all of this a few days ago. And I just want to touch on this because they've been widely misrepresented. I mean, Putin attended a exhibition about Peter the Great, and then he made some comments about him, and he discussed the Great Northern War, and he said that the Great Northern War was not a case of Russia taking from Sweden Swedish territory. It was a case of Russia recapturing territory that had previously been Russian, that had been inhabited by the Slavs, and that this was not unlike what Russia is currently doing in Ukraine. So, of course, this led to a whole flurry of headlines all over the Western media. Putin is a megalomaniac. He thinks he's the new incarnation of Peter the Great and all of those things. What Putin was actually doing in anticipation of Sweden joining NATO was reminding the Swedes that there has been this history between them and Russia, that there have been a succession of wars, and Sweden has lost every one. So he was basically, in a very coded way, telling the Swedes to be careful. By this point, the Russians, who have no faith in Erdogan's vetoes, had already taken the view that Sweden's entry into NATO was a done thing. But Putin did quietly remind the Swedes that if they think that by joining NATO, this is going to give them any opportunity to engage in further adventures in the Baltics, then they're up against Russia, and Russia has defeated them in the past and will defeat them again. So that was the real point of that comment by Putin. I just want to make one final point, which is about Sweden, which is about Tage Erlander's massive military build-up of the 50s and 60s. Obviously, it was also partly intended to provide jobs to Swedish workers. And I'm sure some people in the thread will make that point. So I would say that obviously, partly that was part of the rationale as well. But my main point, anyway, is that the overt motivation for that Swedish military build-up was to counter the Soviets, and that in the 1960s, Erlander entered into what is in effect a defense agreement with the United States. So Swedish neutrality since that time, as I said, has never really existed. Now, Finland is a completely different matter. And here perhaps I'm going to just say something else about Finnish history, because one of the reasons why the Swedes and the Russians don't get on is because, as I said, Sweden has been on the losing side of various wars against Russia. And one of them was a war that was fought during the Napoleonic era between the Russians and the Swedes, in which the Russians captured the former Swedish territory of Finland. And they carved out of this territory what they called the Grand Duchy of Finland, which is essentially the Finland that we know today. And it was never formally, by the way, attached to the Russian Empire, or at least it wasn't formally attached to the Russian Empire until the last days of that empire under Nicholas II. But the Tsar of Russia was the Grand Duke of Finland, and he ran the country through his officials, but also through some Finnish representatives throughout the 19th century, right up until Finland gained complete independence from the Russian Empire at the time of the First World War. So the loss of Finland is one of those factors that has created tensions between Russia and Sweden. And by the way, there's a significant Swedish minority in Finland which remains very anti-Russian to this day. But anyway, putting all that aside, Finland took a different trajectory. After it gained independence, it also became extremely hostile to the Soviet Union. In 1939, Finland and the Soviet Union fought a brief war, the Winter War, which resulted in an eventual Finnish defeat and significant territorial losses to the Soviet Union. Finland then allied itself during the Second World War with Germany. After the German attack on the Soviet Union, it participated in the siege of Leningrad, St. Petersburg, as it formerly was and is now again today. And Finland then in 1944 had the good sense to pull out of the war and to come to an agreement with the Soviets. And one of the conditions that the Soviets imposed upon Finland, in return for Finland remaining both independent and preserving its own social and economic system, the Soviets never sought to make Finland a communist state after the Second World War. One of the provisions was that Finland would become neutral, and that was agreed in 1948 by a treaty between Finland and the Soviet Union in 1948. And in the years after the Second World War, Finland and the Soviet Union became very close. And this was the era of President Urho Kekkonen, who actually attended Stalin's funeral in 1953, who pursued a policy of good relations with the Soviet Union. And these very good relations between Finland and the Soviet Union were part of the reason why Finland was able to develop economically very rapidly after the Second World War, because it became a kind of bridge between the Western world, to which Finland was still a part, because it had a capitalist mixed economy, but it also had good relations with the Soviet Union because of this neutrality treaty. Now, that neutrality treaty was scrapped after the Soviet Union collapsed. It was one of those things that the Soviets, rather the Russians, in one of those extraordinary decisions that were made during the 1990s, agreed to give up. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, Finnish policies shifted. Finnish politicians became more assertive towards Russia, and Finland also gradually gravitated towards the Western camp. And a key figure here was a Finnish politician, Martti Ahtisaari, who came from the areas who originates from the areas of Finland that were conquered by the Soviets in 1939, and who always retained some bitter feelings about this. And of course, he was one of the officials that was sent to Yugoslavia during the bombing war of 1999, when he essentially managed to persuade President Milosevic of Yugoslavia to capitulate to Western demands. So Finland, from the 1990s, has drifted steadily towards the Western camp, and of course has become increasingly integrated in it. And it's important to say that during the Cold War, neither Sweden nor Finland were part of the European Union. But of course, for some time now, they both have been. And of course, joining the European Union is in effect a passport to integration within the Euro-Atlantic system. So when the Russians say, as Dmitry Medvedev, the current deputy chair of the Russian Security Council and the former president of Russia, when the Russians say that Finland and Sweden joining NATO is not going to make any fundamental change to the strategic balance in the Baltic, because it doesn't change the underlying picture in the Baltic, well, Medvedev is in one sense saying the truth. Both Finland and Sweden are EU member states and Western allies, and have been so in all but name for a very long time now.